Welcome to Chapter 5, Early New Orleans Dixieland Style Music and Chicago Style Dixieland Music. Let's see, want to draw your attention to this part that we're looking at, the Dixieland with a small group of players with the rhythm section. You can read through that and listen for that in your listening. We've added a couple of songs to our playlist that we're accumulating for the final exam. Your required listening is here. It's about 18 minutes of listening this week. And there's all kinds of additional listening, just slightly over an hour. All of these things are referenced in this chapter, and I gave you links so you could access them quickly. Okay, first thing to notice is that the eras of jazz, they overlap. They don't have hard beginnings or endings, and all the dates are always approximate. The transition from one era to a new era may come very slow. And oftentimes, when players are playing in a particular style, it might not have the name that we know it from today. That label may come from the players themselves, or from listeners or critiques, or it may come in the rearview mirror from historians. Dixieland music got the label from the original Dixieland band and was applied backwards in time to cover everything that we've heard so far: Creole bands, white bands, ragtime bands. In fact, players moved to Chicago and New York and then began calling the music in New Orleans Dixieland. Labels can be misleading and misapplied, oversimplified, so they should be just taken as general descriptors rather than an all-inclusive um, label for a musical activity of an era. Most musicians are not strictly performing one era or one style, but they grow too, and they have a diversity of skills. So I want you to listen to this interactive guide so you can get familiar with the early New Orleans style. Okay. One thing to consider is that um, slaves brought African music to Virginia in the year 1619. And then other influences came as well from the Caribbean and also European music. But the first jazz that we actually can listen to accurately was recorded, the instrumental jazz was recorded in New York in 1917. So there's 300 years of jazz or of development that we can't actually listen to. W.C. Handy says, music, later known as jazz, was present in Memphis in 1905, but it was 1917 before they knew that New Orleans music was similar in style. Let's go back over there. I think I missed something. Most consider New Orleans the birthplace of jazz because more jazz musicians were bred there than anywhere else. But W.C. Handy counters that. Here's a quote by Dan Morgenstern. Jazz is one of the great and wonderful mysteries of our age. New Orleans cradled this mystery. You don't agree? Have you a better myth? Do you have Louis Armstrong? So Louis Armstrong was kind of the genius of jazz, and we get introduced to him in this chapter. So Dixieland has been retroactively applied to all of New Orleans music from 1890 to 1920. In the 1920, a more representative Dixieland developed in Chicago. New Orleans was, you've got to remember, they were in French possession for its first 46 years. They ceded to Spain in 1764 for the next 36 years. They came back under French rule for a while and eventually came into the U.S. as part of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So all of this made New Orleans kind of different. It was tolerant of all races. It was a natural setting for merging music of West Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean. And New Orleans didn't particularly give recognition to jazz players and their accomplishments in their moment, but once they got world recognition, they certainly did claim them. Okay, we have to remember the oral tradition was combined with the Creoles' formal training. And one of the people we want to look at is Charles Buddy Bolden, who led a marching band using fixed instrumentation. The first jazz bands used that same instrumentation as this marching band did. So Bolden was a cornet player, and a cornet is the trumpet's cousin. They look very similar. And Bolden also attended a shouting congregational church. So his band played ragtime, marches, quadrilles, which you'll remember is like square dancing, blues. His bands played very diverse styles, especially considering that he quit playing by 1907, and a lot consider him the first jazz player. So all this diverse music existed, even though we don't have the recordings to verify it historically. But we do know from the history that it's there. And ragtime and Dixieland developed concurrently, and eventually they merged. This is a great slide, and there's also an interactive guide to listen to here. Note from about 1900 to 1910, about 30 bands existed in New Orleans, and they all played diverse styles. Moving on to Storyville, a kind of unique red light district of New Orleans that existed from 1896 to 1917. And here, the New Orleans alderman, Sidney Story, thought it was a great idea to propose this ordinance where he created a red light district. And this was basically to contain in one place, one section of town, all the untoward activities such as prostitution and alcohol and so forth. And this was a great employment place for musicians, solo pianists, bands, street musicians. It was closed due to another act, governmental act in 1917. But during that time frame, the foundations of jazz occurred, and so Storyville was very important. Let's look at the instrumental roles of the Dixieland Band. And first, you'll remember there's a frontline player. The frontline players were the cornet or trumpet, one or the other, and they played the melody because it was the loudest instrument. Then there was a trombone player who played counter melodies, often of just the root note of the chord, the most important part of that. They also had a clarinet player who played a harmony part, a counter melody that was usually above the trumpet line, and their job was to provide momentum. And let's see, the rhythm section consisted of banjo, tuba, and drums, and they played straight, unaccented beats, just like marching band, okay? This is what you call a flat floor, and that means there's no accents, okay? You'll need to key into that as you listen. So Buddy Bolden's bands did both of these. They did Dixieland and marching band, and they made them very much the same. You need to listen to Dipper Mouth Blues and pay attention to that unaccented 4/4 meter, okay? The frontline players' parts were polyphonic, meaning that they were all equally important and they layered over each other. And that was a trait taken from the European tradition. And also, they were set in form, okay? So they would have an ensemble, begin with the ensemble, then they would have several solo courses, and then end with the ensemble. Usually those front and the end part matched. It sounded improvised, but usually they were all written out. The ensemble sections played from memory, though, rather than looking at music. The ensemble sections were the most important part of this New Orleans jazz style that we refer to as Dixieland. Later, mostly due to Louis Armstrong, the emphasis shifted to solos. Okay, so there's a couple listing things here. Oliver's Sweet Loving Man, which shows that emphasis on the ensemble, and then compare that to Louis Armstrong's Sweethearts on Parade or I've Got a Right to Sing the Blues, and you'll hear that emphasis on the solo, okay? And I've given you clips to that. In these ensembles, there was something known as the king, and the king was a trumpet player because they carried the melody and they were the most important part. And the last one that carried this designation was King Oliver. And we have 37 recordings from 1923 of his, where we can verify that every member of his band was an apt soloist. His solos were longer, and he was featured in these bands. The author, so there was this sense that the jazz came up the river by steamboat from New Orleans to Chicago, but the author points out that it was going on all over the place in Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, even in Europe. And here we start to look at some key players. And Sidney Bashay, I've attached a video to the end of this so you can actually hear him play some. But he introduced the clarinet and the soprano sax. He was the first one to do that. Had a very rich tone, heavy vibrato. He had a big influence. Worked all over New Orleans, New York, Europe, Paris, back and forth. Got sick of it for a while and became a tailor for a couple years. And then went back into music. His travels gave him a sort of sophistication and kept him out of the mainstream stream of developing jazz. So he's a really good one to listen to. We're going to listen to his version of Maple Leaf Blues, okay? Okay, and then another group came out of New Orleans, and that was the original Dixieland Jazz Band. And this is the first band to record jazz, to perform in New York City, and to tour in Europe. In fact, their recording of 1917 is the first recording that we've had. They were young white men who absorbed what the black bands played and copied them. And eventually they developed their own style, but they incorporated barnyard sounds and clowning around. And in fact, there's a piece called Barnyard Blues that I included. Historically, this kind of parallels that minstrel show where you're making fun, cartooning the black person's plight, acting as if the blacks' music was less sophisticated, but nothing could be further from the truth. The original Dixieland Jazz Band played with great energy and exuberance. In fact, there's still a group of that called the Original. They keep that tradition alive today. Okay, so I want to point out here that early recordings were kind of a feat to engineer. Everybody got in the same room and they played toward this large megaphone that was reduced at the other end to a stylus that captured the sound in a wax disc. And so the players in the room had to position themselves on how well the sound carried. The clarinet got to be very close. Louis Armstrong was in the room. He hit the back wall because he had a big sound. And you'll notice from these recordings that a lot of instruments don't pick up very well, like cymbals, the snare drum, the bass. And you can almost always tell early recordings because of that feature. Okay, then we move on to another big player, and here we get into Louis Armstrong, a giant in jazz. There's a whole nother PowerPoint that I want you to see about him, and I've included a little biographical about him too. But you need to read about him growing up in poverty and going to the Colored Waifs Home for Boys, learning to play the trumpet, how that kind of lifted him out of that, gave him a career. How he played with King Oliver and Kid Ory, went to Chicago, began recording on his own, how powerful he was. He played on lots of blues singers' records like Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey. But the one thing that emphasizes that he was a true performing personality. He was a genius. He was sweet, generous, called everyone Pops. Billed as the world's greatest trumpet player by 1925. So there's a lot of material here on the two PowerPoints, this slide deck and the PowerPoint, to get acquainted with him. All of his travels, film career, motion pictures. He was the first jazz soloist, introduced lots of things, improvisation, the scat singing, the personality, and there's stories about him that you're going to enjoy in the reading. The world is in his debt because he really moved jazz along. Okay, and there's lots to read about there. Be sure you spend time with him and listen to West End blues and his music. Moving on to the Chicago style. All right, the Chicago style, when Storyville closed in 1917 due to the Volstead Act prohibiting alcohol in 1919, it caused employment to shift for jazz musicians to Chicago. The railroads, stockyards, and so forth were there. People wanted to hear their music. So you're going to listen to folks like King Ory. You're going to look at features of the jazz style, how the ensemble differed, and listen to another interactive guide. You're going to get introduced to Earl Hines, who played his piano in a trumpet style and was a buddy to and Louis Armstrong. And you're also going to listen to some Benny Goodman and Bix Beiderbecke. And I want to point out here that at the end I've introduced some of these just to give you a sense of who these people are, and that there's another slide deck to see too. And so be sure that you take a look at this one. Okay? Good luck. Bye.